So good evening, and welcome to the second of our series in celebration of the 30th anniversary of the Lonergan Workshop, which by chance is also intended to be a contribution to Father Leahy's initiative, The Church in the 21st Century, very much in relation to the crisis in the Church, especially here in Boston, which is, some people say, ground zero. So, our initial lecture, as you know, was by Professor Nicholas Lash from the University of Cambridge, and that was a tremendous beginning. And when it comes to thinking about our speaker for this evening, I remember one time I was telling Father Joe Flanagan, who's the father of things Lonergan here at BC, that I had met an old friend of his family who remembered how kind his parents had been back in the old days, taking a man he knew to the seminary, the Jesuit seminary at Weston. And Joe was thinking for a while, who on earth might that be? And then he remembered, oh yeah, that's old 8515. And I didn't know what the hell that meant, 8515. And he says, oh, so I asked him, of course, and he said, oh, 8515. 15% of what he said was true, and 85% was embellishment. So when it comes to the topic of Lonergan on sexuality, we tried to get the numbers reversed, and that's not really true. I knew that John would be a tremendous person to speak on this occasion in relation to the crisis in the Church, which we think of as a crisis of affectivity, and he just happened to be exploring Lonergan's finality, love, marriage, a largely unexplored article that Lonergan wrote many, many years ago. And so he said he'd like to share with us what he's been exploring in that light. And I said, fine, I'm so glad. And I think we're all going to be so glad that Father John Hoy is here to speak tonight on this.
Thank you, Fred. Thanks for coming. I'd like to examine the question of gay sexuality, and I'd like to do it within the framework of Lonergan's thought. I find the prodigious amount of work done on Lonergan has not yet exploited his ideas in this particular area of conflict. What I found already from Lonergan is very promising, and I hope I can entice you into a further explanation of the subject within his framework. I think the major insight that he had, that he's bequeathed to the Church, is that if we're faithful to the process of coming to know that we're equipped to employ, and that is beneath our noses, so to speak, we will enjoy a greater degree of order in our own lives, and in turn, we will be agents of social progress. But if we rush pell-mell this way and that in our knowing and our choosing, never adverting to our biases, nor to a method that would ensure integrity in the use of our intelligence and moral sense, we will be agents of social decline, as well as our own worst enemies. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to frame my remarks along the lines of the transcendental precepts of Lonergan, which many of you know already would be attentive, be intelligent, be reasonable, be responsible. he makes a convincing case that this method of his is really our method. When we look in slow motion at what goes into thinking well and choosing wisely. So let me begin with the first precept, be attentive. I want to take in a much fuller picture of gay sexuality than my own abridged, biased version of it has taken in before. I've been increasingly attentive, as I'm sure you have, to the anger of gays, to their hurt and to their marginality. I've also become aware of my discomfort with them because there's something about their sexuality that is even more mysterious than heterosexuality. I was raised, as were most people around my generation, to believe the homosexual orientation to be defective, and therefore that any acts that would come from this orientation would be morally wrong. Believing is the operative word here. We live in a flurry of received beliefs, not all of them warranting our subscription. So be attentive. When I asked myself to be attentive to the subject, my memory went back to a situation in a parish where I was a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, where one of the children in the parish committed suicide because he had revealed to his parents that he was gay. He found no acceptance in them. He found no acceptance from the church. He found no acceptance from the community. So I had to ask myself as pastor, what have I provided by way of comfort to this population? But even posing this subject matter in terms of acts, gay acts, homosexual acts, also makes me uncomfortable. I don't go around judging heterosexuals according to their acts. Why am I being reductionist about homosexuals? The third thing that I've come to be attentive to has to do with my prayer life. I find myself more and more confronted by a Jesus who resists might and main, using the mechanisms of exclusion that he finds in the Pharisees. With that mechanism, they know with certainty the means to righteousness and exclude those who are not conforming to it. Jesus, in turn, knows righteousness, but he locates it in the heart and not in the moral codes that his interlocutors mastered. The result is a palpable attitude of inclusion radiating from him that had sinners flock to him. This picture of the Christ and his inclusionary attitude is not irrelevant to the matters that we'll be examining. The second operation that Lonergan talks about is be intelligent. The second operation of human consciousness has to do with understanding. What can my intelligence contribute to the understandings that I'm able to amass on this topic? I find myself, when I open the question, staring straight at the classical natural law principle that would hold that the only legitimate moral exercise of sexuality is intrinsically connected to procreation and hence to marriage. The precepts of the Church that have informed my conscience and presumably yours can be traced to the inseparable nexus between marriage, procreation, and sexuality. The Church looks more and more quaint in holding this position, since modern cultures look the other way at premarital sex and extramarital sex. And apparently the overwhelming majority of Catholic married couples accept contraceptive intercourse as morally acceptable. But then there's sodomy. That's another matter. Since it's an unnatural act, we can close the books on it. It doesn't warrant re-examination. But I have to ask myself, what am I not understanding here? Is natural law understood that way and used that way a mechanism of exclusion? The classical understanding of natural law arrived at fixed understandings, fixed moral truths, which when known are able to settle our moral questions. Lonergan doesn't trust that understanding of natural law. He calls for a natural law that wants to undergo the process of self-appropriation. He distrusts a facile use of natural law as trying to import a past into a present and future situation without our having to pay the price of making what was known as truth in the past our own. What Lonergan is saying is that the traditional understanding of natural law contained a beautiful foundational constancy. If its understanding was accompanied by an obedience to the movement of the intellect, to being unconditionally open to what is so, what can be predicated as true. For Lonergan, the transcendental precepts were natural law in act, in the consciousness. The transcendental precepts make natural law reasoning fruitful by following not the formalism it had fallen into, but a method via the structures of everybody's consciousness. And if you know anything about Lonergan, you know that he worked a dialectic between the constants of natural law and historicity. This dialectic is present in every individual and in the whole evolution of the human species and all its institutions. One can go to one of two extremes, to fixity or to wholesale change. For Lonergan, the mean between these extremes was human nature as it attentively operates now, concretely, in this moment in history, given the full subjectivity of the person making the moral choices. Therefore, there are two understandings of natural law, one coming from the analysis of nature, of human nature, of the nature of a sexual act. The other coming from attention to consciousness and its operations and how the data of sense and consciousness produce a rationality and in turn feed into conscience, responsibility, therefore making for responsible acts. The traditional understanding was as wise as its knowledge of the natures that it codified. Only here as wise as its knowledge of empirical, physical manifold that goes into the sexual act. When insofar as that knowledge fails to stay updated, to that extent natural law becomes problematic, a prematurely settled trove of moral norms. We have learned and are learning so much more about nature, including the material, physical aspects of our bodies, than was known when natural law certainties about sexuality came to be articulated. Another category of Lonergan's, which is extremely important in this respect, has to do with meanings. Lonergan was sure that our lives are constituted by meanings. And meanings can be simply received or achieved. They are achieved by an authentic subjectivity seeking to be objectively formed and informed. In a word, meanings determined by reality as the subject appropriates it. Therefore, natural law meanings are insecure and must be continually secured by incorporating new data into its normativity. The traditional understanding of natural law itself has been rightly accused of embracing a physicalism, which ascribed more to nature and materiality than to meaning and choice and interiority. In a word, I'm impressed by the way Lonergan relocated natural law, moving it into and through his intentionality analysis with its invariant structures of consciousness. His life's work was to assure the world that a bias-free use of the operations of human intelligence, reason, and responsibility would yield the moral insights that traditional natural law taught as transcultural and transhistorical. He would say that conscience, our sense of moral responsibility, must be formed by the true and the good, as our self-transcending converted subjectivity appropriates it. He trusted rationality, but not rationality solo. He trusted it as having been gifted by God at some point in each person's life, enabling each one of us to live and act from a self-transcending love. Sexuality without moral conversion, that is to say, acting in light of value, the value of the other, rather than self-gratification, will use reason to produce So sexuality without moral conversion will use reason to produce endless, subtle rationalizations in matters sexual. So approaching sexuality empirically teaches us much more about it than approaching it abstractly. Sexuality is a very concrete thing, as you may have noticed. What have we learned looking at sexuality empirically? I found a differentiation of previously compacted terms very helpful to deal with our contemporary conflicts and questions about this matter. I found authors who now tend to distinguish sex from gender from sexuality. So for them, sex refers to the factual physical characteristics of maleness and femaleness we all have. In contradistinction, the term gender refers to the sexual component of a person's psychological makeup and social identity. This leaves the term sexuality to refer to acts that involve the orientation of the whole human being toward intimacy and union with the other. An undifferentiated compacting of these three together, the physical, the psychological, and the unitive, leaves us under-equipped to answer contemporary questions about sex. What has been increasingly evident from the information that psychology, medicine, science has been accumulating in the last century is that there's a non-systematic aspect to gender and therefore to sexuality, not attended to nor accounted for in our previous centuries of moral thought on the subject. This non-systematic element enters the scene, not at the level of sex in the physical sense, but at the level of gender, and therefore of the sexuality that expresses the gender's self-understanding. Chromosomal, genetic, and environmental conditions can move gender and therefore sexuality in directions that don't fit the patterns of normalcy that natural law and society had expected and found acceptable. The result is an ambiguity at the level of gender. Those who function outside the patterns, the systematic patterns that have been considered normal, what are we to make of these marginal types? Lonergan has an understanding of world process that he calls emergent probability. And emergent probability, I think, has a lot to enabling us to take into account the promise of sexuality that functions other than the way we expect it. Emergent probability for Lonergan. He sees the new emerging in jumps that come unexpectedly from within the virtualities of the entities that are horizontally pursuing each their own perfection or their fulfillment as they're scripted to. The jumps, the emergences above and beyond what you expect the person or the being or the entity to do, from the subatomic to the atomic, from the atomic to the organic, and all up down the line. The jumps are only probable. What is necessary is that each being stays within the horizon of its own powers. Once there's a jump, he calls that vertical finality as opposed to horizontal finality. Vertical finality is his term for speaking of the supernatural, that is to say, that which can't be explained by the natural, by the horizontal, by the virtualities and finality latent in the being pursuing its own fullness. In the case of human sexuality, the three levels that Lonergan cites in the article Finality, Marriage, and Love, he talks about the three levels of nature, reason, and grace, and how their intertwining can produce something beyond horizontal finality going to sexual intercourse, leading to procreation, leading to children, leading to the purpose of marriage, the primary purpose of marriage. There's something more, as he explained in our article written in the 1940s, and therefore very prescient in matters that we're only concerning ourselves with now. There's something else that's going on in human sexuality than the horizontal process of acting in terms of nature and reason. And that something more is explained by grace and by finalities over and above the horizontal. Finalities that have to do with the full perfection of each of the spouses, of each of the lovers, and the perfection of each of those lovers in relationship to God. I don't know that I'll be able to have you come to the same hope that I've found in myself, but let me tell you what the end result of that hope is in looking over this material about emergent probability in Lonergan's use of it in relationship to human sexuality. I can envision a future when there will be two kinds of sexuality, not one, that are accepted in the human family. We are not there yet. Why we're not there has something to do with problems both in the homosexual community and the heterosexual community. So let me pick that up as a theme a little later. Lonergan's theory of emergent probability is always calling into question what had been thought of as sufficiently settled before the non-systematic made itself felt. Drastically reduced to here and now and to the matter we're dealing with, we don't know as much about sex as we thought we did before we took into account, or are being pushed to take into account, the question of homosexual people. Natural law has to move, therefore, beyond common sense in its prior attainments. With emergent probability theory, the entry of the statistical data into natural law understandings need not be an entry of a contradictory element. It can be a complementary one. The classical worldview that hatched natural law understanding, that is being updated in modern times by an historical worldview, increasingly flush with statistical data and probabilities, has to deal with questions of frequency rather than physical necessities. A natural law that has not stopped with the insights attained from the past and can take account of the non-systematic as well as the systematic, that is to say, normal sexual orientation and behavior, will keep morality from being rootless and relativistic, which is where it's heading, as you well know. But my understanding, which is now using intelligence in the second area of Lonergan's consciousness, has to deal with an even more pertinent matter. How can two people, enact a sexual act if they are of the same sex, and that act ever be a moral act? Doesn't morality with sexuality mean it has to be rooted in the natural, that is to say, in the physicality that is natural to this action? The physicality that entails the penetration and reception of the male organ in the vagina. This is certainly the way traditional thought, both Catholic and that of other traditions, thought. What could possibly warrant changing that understanding? Possibly nothing can. But once you differentiate sex from gender from sexuality, different understandings of natural and unnatural begin to emerge. Is it necessarily unnatural to perform a sexual act with someone of the same sex to whom one has been committed in a permanent way? But I go back to a point that I made before. Should such an act be judged in isolation from the relationship and the value and the meaning each of the partners invests in their lifelong committed loving? Lonergan's category of vertical finality opens up the centrality of intentionality. What is the intentionality? What is the intentionality of the sexual partners? What he calls the finis operantis. I think that judging an act in isolation from the intention of the actors leaves no room for the category of vertical finality. If we insist on staying at the level of horizontal finality, there's no other judgment that's possible other than a homosexual act between two homosexuals is unnatural. This leaves those whose orientation is homosexual at an enormous disadvantage in society. They have two possibilities: be celibate or be unnatural. We have to ask ourselves, is this right? Is this fair? Is this just? I'm also afraid that the predication unnatural goes back to shaky foundations that began with Aristotle and that have been baptized in Roman Catholicism. Aristotle held that the seed of the male was the instrumental cause that changes the matter supplied by the female into a sentient being. She was the nutritive principle, he would say, and he the efficient cause necessary to produce the soul in humans. From here, the Church concluded that any act that interfered with this process had to be morally wrong, since it would tamper with the world of the spiritual. Their union, after all, was producing a soul. Lonergan has real problems with Aristotle's position, and he cited them on the occasion of Humani Vitae and the big fight that ensued after the publication of that particular document. He says the relationship of insemination to conception is statistical, and it's not an act that always leads to conception and procreating. Quotation, so there arises the question of whether this statistical relationship of insemination to conception is sacrosanct and inviolable. Is it such that no matter what the circumstances, the motives, the needs, any deliberate modification of the statistical relationship must always be prohibited? He would say no. He goes on to critique the Catholic condemnation of contraception because it was tied to Aristotle's erroneous biology. Therefore, he says, this whole Catholic tradition in the matter of sexuality is transitional. Lonergan would see each human being as sexually endowed with what he called a material manifold that is not determinate nor determining of our acts. Rather, we determine these by our intelligence, by our reason, by our affective reasoning, by our choices. We stamp our identities with spiritual capacities, by our judgments and our choices. These are acts that draw upon the organic, physical, material level. But that level doesn't dictate the outcomes, nor the finality of those acts. What does, in the case of sexuality, is the gender identity, the cognitive psychological makeup of the self. But this level, this gender identity level, is polymorphic, making systematization much more difficult than before. Gender identity is not an immediate datum like one's sex is. It is constructed in part through meanings, both those that are immanently generated and those that are socially received. But the variations that go into gender identity come from any number of sources and at every stage of one's development, among which are experiences of one's body, patterns of relationship with male and female persons, parents, expectations as language and culture generate and elicit these. I have a couple pages which I won't read you because they're so inconclusive about the question of the cause, the physical causes of homosexuality. And the authors that I've been reading about this have concluded, after as many as the review of 135 studies, that the field of trying to figure out the chromosomal and genetic and neural and brain genesis of homosexuality is still so young. They know that it plays into a person's orientation and gender identity, but they know only that it plays into it. they also know that it can't be considered a determinant in any final sense. So I won't go through those studies. So gender identity is not something that can be systematized abstractly by assertions about what constitutes femaleness or maleness, since it is a unique construction attained in part by intentionality. I say in part because gender is an experiential, psychological, and material conjugate. But there's something even more radical, and we're still in this cylinder, so to speak, of understanding that's going on in a changing Roman Catholicism. It doesn't have to do with sexuality and understanding it. It has to do with understanding the universality of God's salvific will. Universal and salvific. Let me put this awakening in Roman Catholicism in Lonergan's terms. He had located a moral impotence in all human beings, a universal inability to attain to the good or value or to self-transcending love. But he contended that God meets this universal impotence universally with the power to attain the good, to discern and act on value, to live in self-transcending ways. He calls this endowment by various names: the higher conjugate of love, grace, or Romans 5:5, the love of God poured out into human hearts through the Holy Spirit. Whatever he calls it, it's always unmerited, and it's usually unnamed in the majority of the human race who have received it. But it always acts in the same way. This gift, this grace, this higher conjugate of love, acts on the antecedent unwillingness to love and to be self-transcending. And so it generates an antecedent willingness in human affectivity. If this is so, then those who are oriented in their genders to love those of their own sex will love homosexually. All of us love from our gendered orientation. A lesbian, therefore, will love God, will love another, and will love herself as a lesbian loves. This is not a carte blanche for sexual license, nor for rationalization, but for loving responsibly. That is to say, with the same need for discernment and discipline and integrity as homosexuals must or ought to love. To say otherwise, given this universal salvific gift, seems to me to be telling the homosexual, love, but don't love. This brings me to the third precept in Lonergan's method: be reasonable. We have to make judgments from the understandings and insights we have mulled and concluded to in the second stage of knowing, the understanding stage. But we can only make judgments when there are no more questions. I have a lot of questions about the material we're talking about. But one thing I don't have a question about: I have concluded by going through this exercise that I know I haven't been fair to the gay phenomenon. I also know enough now to know that my previous beliefs and judgments on the subject were not the result of knowledge achieved by self-appropriation. I remain just as conservative and traditional in my understanding of what legitimates the exercise of the sexual act after going through the material that I have as I did before. My understanding of the sex act is that I must say something more than I find you lovable or attractive or arousing. The sexual act must say, I love you, and more than now. It must say, I love you exclusively. It must say, I commit myself to you permanently. Otherwise, I distrust the claim that love is what is being expressed in the act. This is a very conservative understanding of sexuality on my part. At the same time, I'm not convinced that this kind of bond between two people of the same sex should be ruled out of bounds by the state or by the church. Nor am I convinced that it would be morally wrong, or that it is morally wrong, since there are such bonds, and such bonds have their own way of proving their validity. That said, however, other questions are not answered. What I don't find in talking to people or in reading about the subject, and therefore I can't come to an unconditional point where I have no questions left and therefore can come to judgment. What I can't find answers to, does sexuality between homosexual couples have the same unitive binding effect as it can and does have between heterosexual couples? Do gay couples have the same meaning as heterosexual couples about what constitutes fidelity and commitment to one another? What am I to make of the data that questions the praxis and the permanence of homosexual unions, which I read in some of the authors on the subject, like Andrew Sullivan? I can't make judgments until I have no more questions, and I have these questions. I can't make conclusions, not judgments in the sense of judging people. I can't come to conclusions until I have no more questions. One conclusion I have come to is that I have been, and most of us have been, I think, very wrong about our use of the moral tradition that we have in Catholicism. I think we misuse it and are unfaithful to Thomas by importing classical concepts he arrived at in order to answer his questions. These concepts have been made to function as answers to our questions, without going through the interiority and self-appropriation he used in developing them. To be true to Thomas, we would have to arrive at concepts by having the particular inner words born in our understandings that address our questions. Our understandings are seriously diminished by rushing past the dynamism of our intelligence to know, and by having past concepts, including his, do the work of knowing that we then do negligently. Thomism, or more accurately the scholastic tradition after Thomas, defined each concept with a fixed meaning and used the laws of logic on these defined concepts with their meanings to produce eternal verities. The product of this method was not eternal verities, but static abstractions that left the subjects for whom the intelligibility was meant out of the process. The faithful were in this way subjected or made subjects to the fruit of others' cognition. And insofar as they have not been made privy to the process or the method, they are more like objects of the teaching than subjects who can take it into account. I'm not quarreling with the fruits of the process of reflection or with the methods of an Aristotle or an Aquinas. What I want to say with Lonergan is that their works, quote, contain no account of introspective method, whereas Lonergan's great gift to society and to the church is to give us an account of human intentionality, which is free to function within its capacities as it seeks the goods. So I come to the last of the stages in the development of understanding and responsible action. The fourth is be responsible. What is helpful here is the understanding Lonergan has of moral conversion, a conversion that has one move beyond one's own wants and satisfactions and acts into values, the value of the other, the good of the other, a firm commitment to the other's good and fidelity to the other. Relationality born of value is of God. It cannot be explained by flesh, which stays in the horizon of its own finality. Sexuality as such has a weight to contend with, a weight which, au naturel, will very likely be self-seeking and self-gratifying rather than self-transcending, union-intending and other-directed. The finality of the sexual act and its only justification beyond procreation is that it is love-making, love-constituting, and love enacting. Vertical finality describes a sublation of sexuality, exercised from a horizontal finality, the finality it has from nature. And a sublated sexuality is evidence of the presence of an antecedent willingness to the good and the value. That antecedent willingness almost certainly has God as its final explanation. When the sexuality of a person is moving in the direction of the finality God intended for it, it will find a transcendent meaning. Love as gift is given so that sexuality's meeting can attain to a transcendent meaning. The parties to a sexual union, gay or straight, therefore, must ask themselves whether their union is open to a relationship to God. Is it enhancing their relationship to God? Is their love of one another experienced as a continuum with God's loving of them? Are they finding themselves growing in their love and attention to others? Granted, these questions have a difficulty in being answered, since being loved by God is a non-objectifiable quality to our experience. We feel transcendent meaning more easily than we articulate it. Nevertheless, the terminus ad quem, the point at which all human sexuality is vectored for its fulfillment, is God. Not God eventually, but God now mediated through the love of one another. The evidence of the holiness between two persons, whether gay or straight, will be that each partner is the instrument of grace for the other, to transcend their relationship and its immanent meaning. Transcendent meaning relates us to God as the known unknown. Known because the transcendent God is known through a glass darkly. Unknown because God is always greater. Deus semper maior. Since God gives us God's meanings on things about the Spirit, may the Holy Spirit come upon us and the Church and teach us more about sexuality than we've been able